today's discussion is safeguarding the supply chain, how to survive and succeed during COVID-19. I am Claude Murray, co-founder and president of SirionLabs and your host for today. Before we start, there are a couple of housekeeping items. The webinar slides and the recording will be emailed to you right after the session. And if you have any questions that you want to pose to the panel, please do so on the chat in the webinar panel, and we will try and answer as many of those as we can at the end of the session. Next, let me quickly introduce to you the organizers of this webinar. First is Vodafone. Vodafone, as you probably know, is a technology communications company with approximately 625 million mobile customers, 27 million fixed broadband customers, and 22 million TV customers. Next is Roland Berger, with more than 50 years of experience in continuous growth and working in 35 countries. Roland Berger is one of the leading players in global top management consulting with successful operations in all of the major international markets. And then we all know IACCM very well, the International Association for Contract and Commercial Management, and they have been around for a very long time, helping us as professionals in the space. IACCM today have 60,000 members around the world, 23,800 organizations that belong to them in 183 countries. And SirionLabs is a leading enterprise contract management software that helps enterprises manage the complete contract lifecycle from authoring to performance through invoice validation and closure on a single, easy-to-use platform. With that, let me briefly introduce to you also the co-speakers for today. First is Detlef Schulz, who is a seasoned procurement executive with global experience across many industry sectors. He holds several board seats for the Vodafone Group and works as a senior advisor at Roland Berger. Detlef joined Vodafone in 2003 to lead the global supply chain team and eventually heading up the Luxembourg-based Vodafone procurement company. He stepped down from this role as CEO in 2016, but continues today to serve as chairman of the board of directors for Vodafone Procurement Company. Michael Pfluger is Roland Berger senior partner in operations and an internationally experienced and recognized expert in business model innovation and transformation, with a strong focus on procurement and supply chain management. He has more than 25 years of experience in line functions in the industry and as a management consultant, and his extensive experience is in the implementation of mission-critical programs for corporate transformation, and he has supported large organizations in developing their procurement and supply chain management functions. And then Paul Branch from IACCM, where he is the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Technology Officer. Paul has worked in the telecommunications and IT industry for over 30 years, with more than 20 years spent in various buy and sell contract and commercial management positions. Most recently, Paul was head of deal assurance for the BT Group, delivering complex change programs, dramatically improving CCM delivery there. With that, I'm going to hand over to Detlef, who will be the moderator for today's discussion.
Thank you, Claude. Whilst we all have experienced a variety of crisis situations on banking, currencies, state debts, and even pandemics, if you think of SARS, the COVID-19 or Corona crisis is unprecedented and certainly much larger and impactful than anything we experienced so far. 185 countries, officially 2 million infected people across the globe, and sadly 120,000 deaths speak a cruel language. Global economies are hit hard. In this environment, supply chain management and procurement get an extraordinary attention. In her last press conference before the Easter break, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel got a question on the supply of protective masks. She explained that traditional procurement does not lead to supply. A transformation is needed, and agile procurement and procurement strategies a must. That, I think, sets the scene for our webinar today. We will deal with these complex situations in 3 levels. First, we talk about the critical focus areas for companies to minimize the COVID-19 impact, before we then discuss the opportunities through the implementation of digital tools in a wider sense. Last but not least, let's discuss some real-world examples. So let's start on the global level before we drill deeper into industries and activities. And in that regard, I would like to ask Michael, what effect is the pandemic having on the global economy, and what do you think is likely to follow? Michael?
Thank you, Detlef. Yeah, thank you, Detlef. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I believe the map we're seeing right now is truly alarming. Many countries around the globe see their production facilities standing still and supply chains being interrupted. When we start and follow the life cycle of the pandemic in Asia, here we see an inconsistent picture where China and South Korea are slowly relaxing the lockdown situation, are returning to a new way of normal, let's say. Malaysia and India are still in rigorous lockdowns. If we move further to Europe, the heavily impacted countries of Italy and Spain see their people and economies threatened, and this will potentially reignite the euro crisis, and even economic powerhouses like France or Germany are facing standstills. The US is rocketing its unemployment numbers into historic heights, and despite first interventions of central banks and governments, it's massive uncertainty and nervousness in the markets and the stock exchange. There have been indicators even before C-19 that globalization has reached its peak, but I guess since COVID-19, more and more investors are pulling out monies from emerging markets, and all of this, to me, clearly indicates that we're moving into a massive global recession. On the other hand, I think it's not as easy as this, and we need to take a differentiated view for the various industry sectors. And according to our Roland Berger study, we see segmented industry sectors, or we segment industries into 4 clusters according to the impact on short-term liquidity and the impact on 2020 profitability. So apparently, as all of us, or most of us, are experiencing every day, we face travel restrictions and curfews, and they massively impact retail. Most airlines have grounded 100% of their fleet. Hotels around the globe are empty. And this has a significant impact on liquidity and on profitability. Now, while retail will be able to catch up on some of the lost sales, airlines and hotels will find it difficult to fill yesterday's capacity. So when we think of more costly objects like cars, then we will see a catch-up. But at the same time, this industry will suffer from the massively reduced buying power due to recession and related unemployment. So in very few industries, can say there's a positive impact. And those potentially didn't desire that impact, because that's clearly in pharma and medtech when it comes to face masks, as you already alluded to, and to ventilation equipment.
So this is Paul. Let's share with you now some IACCM research that really reinforces and supports the analysis that Michael's just shared with you. So this research last month looked at across 800 corporations within the IACCM membership. It looked at supplier and customer performance and the impact therein, whether it was in a limited way. If you look at the date here, the 6th of March, towards the beginning of the pandemic, impacting certainly us here in the US. The shape of this bar chart has changed dramatically, and our subsequent research has reinforced that. But back in the 6th of March, there was certainly some folks were seeing limited impact, others were seeing moderate, and some with severe. Now, the analysis, though, was quite interesting in that we looked at the disruption level by industry. So on our next slide there, the top 5 impacted, the most disruptive industries there. We'll look at the top and bottom. So really echoing the research that Michael presented from Moody just now. You see that, no big surprise, automotive technology in terms of hardware, where you have these extended supply chains, transportation, logistics, oil and gas. We've all seen the impact on the global oil and gas industry, and in healthcare. But I think what's worth pointing out, though, certainly our research has shown that whilst this is materially disruptive, it may not all be bad. You know, with all of these the risks that are being piled on into many of these sectors, there are also material opportunities, particularly in my industry, in the IT services industry. There's particularly a huge amount of incremental growth. You've only got to look at companies like Zoom, for example, where the demand for their product has grown substantially over the last few weeks. So that's a macro and a micro picture based specifically on the feedback from our membership as to where this level of disruption is impacting as a consequence of the virus. Back to you, Detlef.
Thank you, Paul. Whilst there are material opportunities, as you said, there is still a lot of disruption across various industries. So what do you guys think? And maybe Michael, you could respond to this. What are the key concerns and challenges for businesses today?
Yes, thank you, Detlef. So clearly, we see many organizations facing both demand shocks and supply shocks. And as I was briefly touching upon earlier, the only positive demand shock, unfortunately, that we see is in respiratory face masks and ventilation equipment. Most other industries are facing negative demand shocks, and we discussed airline tickets, and we discussed hotel accommodation already. Also, at the moment, there are no cars bought or sold. So automotive industry is definitely suffering from a demand shock and a supply chain shock at the same time, as the Chrysler example on the slide illuminates. However, when we specifically think of the multi-tier automotive supply chain, this highlights another issue. The further down the tiers you go, the less industry specific a component manufacturer is. And while a shortage of a supply might not be a major issue if your demand is down as well, if we're not taking into consideration negative impacts on asset utilization in large plants, but it is a massive problem if all mass manufacturing facilities are under lockdown, as we've seen in China, or if the production capacity for ventilation machines is impacted and cannot be upgraded in the very short term. So this balance between demand and supply is massively out of balance.
So in an environment like the one you just described, how should business leaders position themselves then for the new reality? Michael?
That's not so easy to answer, given that we are not too certain what the new reality will look like, when it will kick in,
yes.
and how long it will take to stabilize. That said, the key will be to anticipate when to ramp down your business, to which degree to ramp down the business, i.e., will you shut down and temporarily stop the business, or will you ramp down partially and repurpose your business? And most importantly, when and how to stop the hibernation mode again and ramp up business again. And as we discussed before, this implies that there's no single correct answer for the business leaders how to position themselves for the reality, as this may and will vary massively by industry, geography, and also on the pre-C-19 state of the economy and the individual businesses. Some have been in distress before. But the one thing I think I can suggest to business leaders, though, is to always know their options, and thus to work with scenario analysis to evaluate these options and to have respective action plans in the drawer to not lose time when the time has come. And assuming C-19 is not the last pandemic and is not the last recession that we're facing, this capability of being prepared and conducting scenario analysis based on facts and figures is a further suggestion to continue what has been started in the context of digitalization, to establish exactly those capabilities in terms of transparency, data and analytics capabilities for better and faster decision making.
Yeah, thank you. You talked about having action plans in the drawer. I think we have to have discussions about business continuity planning and scenario analysis. Claude, what is your take on this?
Yeah, I think as we look at the situation and you look at some of the statements made from a political perspective that this may be over in a very short term, I think reality tells us it's going to be very different. The general consensus is that there will be 3 phases. Of course, we are today in the protect phase, where the economy is being sacrificed for the health of the people. And there are signs that some of this is passing, and by different country, of course, but that we may start, at least in the US, to see the end of the tunnel in this, although I think that it's more likely that we will see 3 waves rather than a single wave of this in the US, just because of size and the fact that it spreads at a different pace in different parts of the country. What we do know is there is not an on-off switch that somebody can press and all of a sudden we're going to go back to the way it used to be. It is generally thought that the next phase will be what is called the reopen phase, that stores and offices will start to reopen. They will open differently. Not everybody is going to go back to an office. More people will stay at home and work from home. There will be social distancing from a period of time. We also believe that there is going to be a partial to full economy rebound. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that in certain economic strata, what you will find is that there is pent-up spend demand. People are sitting at home, they are not buying cars, they are not going out to dinner, and therefore they are accumulating cash if they are still being paid. The other side of the coin is that so much of people in the lower strata and increasingly in the middle are now unemployed. And once the economy starts again, they will not just start spending again, they will have to do some catch up. And it's going to take a much longer time for those parts of the economy to become spenders again in that sense. During this phase, we believe that businesses will probably start to spend on a more cautious basis. Yes, the 2.1 trillion US stimulus is going to help, for example, in the US, same in other parts of the world, but there will be a caution on the side of business in terms of how they spend. Then finally, we will reach the normalization phase, and that generally is thought as having a high dependency on not only very wide level of testing, but also finding an existing drug that can effectively reduce the mortality rates. People will at that point start to feel safe about going about a more normal existence again. But at that point, we will have to face two other realities in the economy. Of course, there will be a deficit given all the stimulus that is provided by the government. Somehow that has to be made up again. It is not just printing money, as many people may think, and therefore there will be a deficit that needs to be addressed, and inflation might become an issue at that point in time. The last point there for me is also that the supply chain is not just going to switch itself on overnight. In fact, in the US, as an example, as late as yesterday, you start seeing very large food producers closing factories. So we have not reached the bottom of that yet. I think there will be more disruption in the supply chain for a period of time before we can start rebuilding that supply chain. And that, of course, is going to take quite a period of time. And then I think the data, if we look on the next slide, is very telling. If you look at GDP, for example, around the world and by certain parts of the world, the negative GDP that is now seen in 2020, minus 2.1% overall in the US, minus 2.3, Europe zone, minus 6.5. These are significant numbers, and it's going to take quite a while for us to overcome that. So I think what we see increasingly is a deeper, longer recession that we have to deal with and have to plan for now. So back to you then, Detlef.
Just before you hand back to Detlef, just an observation from me, Claude, if I may. This plays very neatly back into the point that Detlef made earlier about the need for scenario planning. Many of the factors that you've just talked about have impacts external to an organization. So scenario planning, therefore, is critically important. We don't know how deep the ramp down is going to hit. We don't know how long it's going to last, and we don't know how long that recovery phase is going to be. So that's where the scenarios really come into play, and organizations like ours can do a great deal by applying appropriate scenarios to drive quality business decisions.
Thanks, Paul. I think you guys all said we are facing an uncertain future. Pretty much everybody has been hit by this situation. And given the fact that you see everywhere the slogans of "we're in this together," "we make it out of this together," etc., the question is whether a classic cost reduction approach in the current environment is appropriate, or whether we have to watch out for the health of our suppliers. So in that regards, my question would be, what should procurement be doing to ensure that the health of our suppliers and our supply chain is protected? How do organizations support their suppliers? And if you guys, okay, maybe Michael could start and then hand it over to Paul and Claude afterwards, please.
Yes, absolutely, Detlef. Thank you very much. And indeed, we as Roland Berger, we run a lot of cost reduction programs. And you're making a very important point. We are in this together relates to both, to the population in our cities and our countries, but also to our economies and to our companies. And I think as the population, we're doing really well. So through our behavior, we're managing to flatten the curve slowly but surely. But we need to translate that into a solidarity and ethical business behavior as well. It's playing an important role. Clearly, this is easier said than done, but it's also very clear that companies cannot secure supply and cannot sustain their supply base or their supply chains by squeezing their suppliers like a lemon. So, of course, if you are an airline caterer, for instance, and your top line sees a 90% decline, you have to flex your cost base, no doubt about it. But it requires a responsible and differentiated approach. We talk about smart segmentation. So it is important to consider the strategic relevance of a supplier for your business, but it's likewise important to consider the importance of a supplier for the local ecosystem, for the society. I have a client in the food delivery service business, which is now actively supporting their suppliers by providing financial support. Other companies are extending rather than shortening payment terms to help with liquidity. But the together finds even different ways, like it could imply collaboration of competitors in non-differentiating areas to allow common suppliers to benefit from economies of scale and then sharing these in the ecosystem. And some of this will remain and will definitely see longer lasting changes in the sense, in the way we do business. Paul, if you want to add?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think for that to really come to fruition, we need to reevaluate the commercial models that we have in place. We need to innovate, look at how we can drive innovation into those supply relationships, and in that total review, then look to different commercial models that will support those engagements. Agile is just one of the opportunities that are out there. But as you were talking, Michael, that food delivery business, maybe we could move, instead of moving to the delivery of bread rolls, we could move to a service model that had a satiated passenger as an outcome. So there are different ways to develop a commercial framework. And that, as contract and commercial management professionals, that calls upon us to raise our game, different set of skills, different set of systems, certainly different approach, and one that is much more based on relationships. That's the way that certainly IACCM sees us moving through the COVID-19 into this new era. Claude?
Yes, I fully agree with the two previous speakers, but I would like to just shine a light on another issue that is coming back now to haunt us a little bit, because this is somewhat the sins of the past that is now being exposed. And the easiest way to look at that is if you look at what has happened since 1980 over the last 40 years, you see that the GDP overall has grown by almost 80%, 79%. At the same, during that same period, the bottom 50% of the workforce, their income has only grown by about 20%. And if you take the next 40%, that middle 40% has only grown by about 50%, and so on. And if you start thinking through how companies are going to have to deal with some of this, there is definitely going to be a human aspect to this, where already we start to see the people now standing in lines for food and that bottom 50%, but we're also seeing people losing jobs in the middle 40%, and that probably is going to increase. So we have a situation here where we have to not only think as companies about our supply chain, but also about our workers and the workers in the supply chain, and find that as part of the balance. So not sure we have an answer to that, but it's going to be one of the aspects that we need to look at as well. So with that, back to you, Detlef.
Yeah, thank you, Claude. So clearly the world has changed, societies will change, but what will change for supplier managers? Claude, maybe you can continue and talk a little bit about the changes for supplier managers and contract managers. And once you're on this, can you give some advice on what lessons have been learned and what supplier managers can do different to get ahead of the curve?
Right, thanks. Yes, so for me, there is obviously bad news on this, but there's also a lot of good news in this for us as contract managers, supplier managers. Yes, it is affecting. The latest data shows about 60% of companies in the US have moderate to severe impact. Again, I think we haven't reached the bottom of that. I think that number is going to grow. But as we look at that, if you stand back and think about the business we are in, and I've been in this one for about 25 years, contract and supplier managers traditionally have been the stepchildren in the company. We have been waving our hands, we've asked to be seen, we've asked for attention, and nobody was really interested in that. And all of a sudden, we find ourselves at the forefront of this issue. All of a sudden, we need to be able to analyze the contracts, we need to renegotiate the contracts, we need to give information about the supply chain, the health of the supply chain, and all of a sudden, what we have been doing quietly in the background is now at the senior level of interest to everybody. But that also means there's an immediate need for resources who can immediately renegotiate contracts, monitor suppliers at a much higher level than we've done before. And of course, we all know that those types of resources are not easy to come by. What we see here is a clear division now of tech haves and tech have-nots. Those companies that have been working hard at enabling themselves technologically in the space of supplier management, contract management, are at a significantly bigger advantage because they can do so much more with so much less, and they can do it so much faster. Companies that have not done that are at a clear disadvantage. And this is an opportunity for organizations that haven't gotten to that level of technology to now get to that point. And one of the things that I want to point out here is that in these difficult times, my experience is that if you come to senior management with a solution in terms of helping to minimize risk, helping to reduce the detrimental impact of what we're going to see, there is always capital available to do that. So when you were always number 4, number 5 in line of getting the capital to do the technology advances you wanted to do in your organization, now is the time to show what you can do, how you can help the company. And so in a way, that is a very big opportunity for us. Of course, if people are still thinking about planning for the COVID environment now, that planning is past. We should be in the execution phase right now. Where we should be focusing and what we should be planning on is how do we deal with this recession. And as the other speakers have said, there's no clarity here. You will have to have 2, 3, 4 alternatives and say, if X happens, we need to do Y. If Z happens, I need to do this. So that planning now has to take place. The other thing that I think is very important for us to understand, if you don't take the leadership now, because this is all contract supplier management relationship, this void will be filled by somebody else in the business. So it is not a time to sit still. It's not a time to wait for things to get back to normal. This is the time to take a leadership stance and to help your organization to put itself in a place where it can survive and it can thrive over the next couple of years in this space.
Yeah. Thank you, Claude. Thank you. Whilst you highlighted the need for technology in contract management, and we will talk about this a little later, Paul, maybe I can ask you in the context of contract management, whether the current crisis has an impact on the contracting management, on contracting policies in general, and whether there are specifically any changes seen already.
We are definitely seeing changes for sure. Reflecting on what Claude just shared, it is true about 60% of our membership have not yet deployed any automation to support contract and commercial management. But our research also shows that within the next 12 months, over half of them plan to make material investments in their automation capability. But let's look at what the impact is on the contracting policy, to Detlef's question. We're seeing material shifts in three major areas. On the overall sourcing strategies and market exposures. Now, I guess that's not surprising really given the environment that we're in right now. But also a focus on exposure or concentration in particular markets and what can be done to mitigate that exposure or that concentration. And then to the contracts themselves, a focus on the terms and conditions that are currently within the existing contracts or that will be let into future contracts. And it's not just looking at the force majeure provisions, which obviously is a major focus right now, but it's also on delivery characteristics and how to exit from contracts gracefully. So there's a lot of work going on in this space, and it's really shining that, as Claude said earlier, shining that spotlight on these particular facets. So really, really interesting.
Thank you,
Paul. Maybe we should look at the consequences of these shifts in policy. That's certainly really key in my area. I think that the most significant impact that we've seen is a consequence of the research that was completed just last week, actually. There's a real focus now on nearshoring or increasing domestic sources of supply where that is possible to shorten the length of the supply chain. Also increasing the visibility on the risks that exist specifically in low-cost or emerging markets. What can be done to minimize, mitigate the risks, or at least put it under some form of control. And even a relatively small but significant proportion of our members are really looking, at bringing in activities back into house for those that have been outsourced. These are material changes to contracting policy, operations, and delivery that strike at the very core foundations of what a company does. So yeah, the impacts are quite significant.
Thank you, Paul. So we all talked about scenario planning. Claude, Michael talked about the recovery phase, but how do we really identify the inflection point when the business is coming back, and how do we know, and what do we have to do to prepare the return to growth? Michael, you want to start?
Yes, more than happy to start this off. And I guess I covered some of this in my previous answers. So just quickly summarizing this, know your options is one, work with scenario analysis, have your action plans ready, and continue the digitalization that you've started to establish those capabilities, to have transparency, to be able to analyze data, to come to the right conclusions and to the right decisions, as Claude mentioned before. And I guess, unfortunately, in absence of this, if you're not there yet, then you have to rely on a couple of really simplistic indicators that are not necessarily rocket science. So learn from the countries that are a little bit ahead of you, of your own country, in the C-19 crisis life cycle, and then look at public shutdowns and if and when and to which degree they are lifted. This impact on the demand that will hopefully pick up subsequently, customers coming out of their hibernation mode, and ultimately competitors, suppliers restarting their engines and their production again.
Yeah, thank you. We talked about technology. Claude emphasized the need for technology. Paul talked about automation in contracting management. Do you guys, and maybe this question goes to Paul and to Claude, do you think that the current crisis will raise or increase the appetite for automation, specifically in contract management?
Definitely. Based on the results from our most recent research, as I shared, about half of the participants who have not yet invested in technology automation are considering material investments in the next 12 months. That's a material shift from where we were before the COVID-19 crisis. It is interesting, though, that when you start looking at the differences between how procurement groups have invested in technology compared to their sell side colleagues, you start to see stark differences. Interesting if you start looking at things like how easy it is to find contracts, or how easy it is in this portfolio analytics space, how easy it is to search contracts for specific clause data, or indeed in some of the more advanced analytics where you're looking for risk profiling and assessing obligation extraction and tracking and management, where you're looking across portfolios of contracts. There's clearly differences in the ease with which different communities can achieve those results. So the reality is, as a contract and commercial management discipline, basically outside of the storing, the simple storing and authoring control of documents, very few corporations have made enterprise-wide investments in their contract automation technologies, and the need to do these and these sorts of analysis rapidly has really brought that to the fore. Claude, what do you think?
Paul, yes, agree with you 100%, but I think there's sort of a layer on top of that as well. When we talk about this, we tend to talk about what I would call almost the basics of what can and should be done with technology, to, like you say, finding the contracts, searching the contracts, identifying certain clauses. But then when we also come to the analysis and quick assessment that needs to be done, I think there's going to be a significant shift now, as I need to understand more about my supply base, more about my suppliers going concern. I have to assess that faster. I have to monitor performance no longer on a monthly basis or quarterly basis as I used to do, but I need to do this almost at near real time. I need to be able to assess that, and look at what the trends are in terms of their performance. I can't wait for a result that is looking in the rear view mirror. I need to look forward. I need technology to help me do that. I need to be able to very rapidly renegotiate I can't afford to spend 6-7 weeks on it, or even 3 weeks on it. Technology needs to be in place that can help me with that. Identify the opportunities for cost reduction. That is a function that can be done through automation so much better, so much faster. And then the overall view of my supply chain becomes so much more important. I think you said something very important, Paul, that this can't be done in isolation anymore. A group here, a group there, maybe on my sell side, not on my buy side, or vice versa. This has to be an enterprise priority, and it needs to be done that way. And just to give you an example of this is what you can do today by literally at the push of a button say, which provisions am I missing in contracts? Which provisions do I need to renegotiate? I can look and see what is indemnity across my contracts, what is cost of living adjustments across the contract. That kind of technology that gives you instant information and patterns and trends is what's going to be needed in order to get to the next level, which I believe companies are going to have to be at. And when you start thinking about so many more people working remotely, you can't do that without the right level of technology either.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. Michael, maybe since you talked about some of your clients, maybe you can share with us some examples how companies are dealing with the crisis, and specifically how they use process innovation and technology innovation.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's really multifold. And the most obvious is what we are currently doing, leveraging webinars and all kinds of collaboration technology to work remotely and from home. I think Claude alluded to that in his introduction when he mentioned Zoom and their revenue going through the roof. I believe this will have a long-lasting effect, consulting business or my business. I don't think that I will ever fly to another continent for a single meeting like I did in the past. I will never do that again. I think over the last couple of weeks, we've learned that working remotely is perfectly feasible. And clearly, those companies that have embarked on digitalization before can now benefit from it. Again, Claude said that before. If they have transparency on demand signals, on inventories, on planned deliveries, on supplier performance, risk indicators, they benefit so massively from that capability. And even if you go a step below that and you think of process harmonization and leveraging industry standards, organizations and clients who have done that are so much in a better position to flex their production. When we talk about Apple and Tesla, Apple is doing face shields. Tesla is developing ventilation equipment from their cars. One of my clients who's producing machines to produce all kinds of household paper tissues, they have recently started producing face masks themselves. And another example is where the largest German companies from various industries use their global procurement capabilities, their global processes, their supply networks to help the German government to procure face masks from the global markets. You mentioned that in your introduction. So I see a lot of established capabilities, both from a technology perspective, but also just process maturity, harmonization, to help. And all kinds of category intelligence or commodity intelligence, providing business insight, business foresight, helping category managers or commodity managers to work with their peers around the globe, to work with their business partners. All of this is supporting this.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Listen, guys, since we want to share some time or reserve some time for questions and answers, maybe we should have some thoughts about our final message to everybody. And if you allow me to, I take the first one. I was always impressed by the Japanese because their word of crisis has two kanjis in it. The kanjis are danger and opportunity. And I think this says it all. Each crisis provides us with opportunities, and that's what we have to focus on. Do you guys want to add something in regards to final messages? And then I give it back to Claude, who is then conducting the question and answer session. Paul?
I will add to
Claude?
that.
Okay.
That I think that, you know, these times of uncertainty is a time of great opportunity, but also I think anybody who sits and waits for the old normal to be back again, the old way of doing things, I think you will be in for a big surprise. I think this has fundamentally changed the way in which we are going to do things. And along with that, I would add the aspect of we need to consider the ethics and what we do with this, because as things get more difficult, we will have to do that and think through that as well.
Yeah, that's the point that Michael raised. I totally agree. The only other thing, perhaps I absolutely agree with what's on the slides here, but maybe the other point is that's worth looking at is that this is a pivot point. Before, certainly in the CCM discipline, some of the automation and approaches that we've talked about today were considered as sort of nice to have. And I think Claude said you were second or third or fourth on the agenda and at the C-suite. Now the recognition is that certainly for those that have dipped their toe in the water of automation and seen the benefits, this technology is essential. It's essential for business survival going forward. So now is the time to start picking up the pace on these major transformations.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm just looking at the clock a little. We could spend hours and continue on this discussion, but I think I hand it back to Claude. I thank you all for your contributions. It was a great discussion. As I said, there is much more to say, and we could spend further hours on it. But Claude, we wanted to save some time for questions and answers. Do you want to take it from here?
Yes, thanks very much. And I'm going to ask DJ, one of my colleagues who has been tracking all the questions coming in. DJ, if you want to give us questions and just point to the person on the panel that you think should be answering it.
Sure, Claude, would love to do that. So the first question is for Michael, and the question is, how will this crisis impact the dynamic between procurement and finance?
Very good question, and short answer to this, I think, as said for other functions, I think we will see closer collaboration, which means shorter budget management cycle times, and this implies both target setting and performance measurement and management, and more frequent feedback loops between procurement and finance.
Thank you, Michael. Paul, do you want to add to that?
Yes, not a different, but a sort of alternative view is I don't think it really matters, provided the contract and commercial management discipline is performed effectively across the corporation. So whether there's parts of that, to Michael's point, you know, these feedback loops going between the divisions, all very healthy and driving best business practice, great. But it's to the end of ensuring that the end-to-end contract and commercial management process is delivered in the most effective way, using the appropriate blend of automation, tools, resources, people, and process.
Thank you, Paul. The next question is, I think first Claude can answer that, and Paul, maybe you can add to it later. So the question is, traditionally, technology has lagged in contract and supplier management space. So can it carry us in the future given the new demands?
Yeah, that's a great question, and yes, that is correct. For a long time, we have seen that the technology in this space did not meet the demands of what companies wanted. I think that has changed very significantly in the last couple of years, and I think the technology now is at a place where it can definitely help and assist us. Anything from artificial intelligence to natural language processing, the ability to extract obligations out of a contract, extract metadata out of a contract. That stuff is now real. It's now starting to work in with many suppliers, excuse me, to the very sophisticated analytics that we now start to see. And equally important that in the past, companies bought technology for themselves. That is not going to help us in the future. You now need to buy technology that gives you and your supply chain, or if you're a supplier, your customers, access to the same set of data, so that you don't argue about whose data is correct, but you can focus on delivery at the level that you're supposed to deliver. I think the technologies now, and certainly there's ones on the market that will help you give that kind of access across your supply chain, so that you can all work as one, and you have that transparency both to your customer but also to your supplier.
Yeah, Claude, totally agree with that. The ability to work systems effectively across the entire supplier ecosystem is mission critical. You know, near real-time sharing of data, the application of blockchain, for example, is a great example of bringing that together. But I agree, you know, that there's and it is this pivot point, changing opportunities to deliver portfolio analytics, the ability to look at performance across your contracts, massive thing. But we shouldn't also forget that a proportion of our members still have contracts in filing cabinets. So you need to dip your toe in the water. Now is the time to do that, to start moving from filing cabinets into a document storage area where you can start doing author and control, and you can start doing some of these more simple things, and that lead you very rapidly then into a portfolio and analytics capability that is AI, natural language process based. That's the way it's moving, and that train is leaving the station.
Great.
Thank you, Claude and Paul. One more question here, and I think Detlef, you can take this one. Can you share examples on how to work together with suppliers in a crisis, and more specifically, what help can procurement provide to struggling suppliers?
Yeah, let me focus on the financial side, DJ, if that's okay, and ignore for a moment the demand side, etc. I think when it comes to weak finances in our supply chain, then procurement has an opportunity to change payment terms, and this time not to extend them, but to pay earlier. Clearly, you will take a hit on your working capital, but I think here you can document ethical procurement at its best by paying earlier. Secondly, I think weak suppliers sometimes are crying for help and looking for a stronger partner. So you could be, as a procurement professional, the broker between potential partners. You could find strong partners for weaker suppliers. Those could be other suppliers who want to extend their portfolio, or even financial investors. Another opportunity could be to run the finance department for specifically our smaller suppliers. Here, customers, larger customers like Vodafone, could provide financial experience to the smaller supply base and help them to get their finances straight. And last but not least, I think in that regard, and I did this when I was in the US, you could take equity in your suppliers and then sell that equity later back when the supplier's in a much better shape.
Good. Thank you, Detlef. I think we are out of time. What is next? Please complete a brief survey at the end of the webinar. That really gives us great feedback and helps us plan for the next webinars. And please look out in your email for copies of the slides and also a copy of the recording of the webinar. And please join us in the future for other such events. And on behalf of SirionLabs and our panelists, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.